Mr. Speaker, we've made a mistake in the past. We put environment at the back seat. We put environment at the back seat because we think that development is the only concern, and we think this is about time that we reverse the sort of mistake that we made, and Scientology is very proud to stand on that side. Let's analyze status quo. We think that in the status quo, developed countries are moving towards environmental healthy progress. We think that developed countries are more concerned, and the progress is also focusing on development, on environment. And let's look at the context of developing countries, countries who are naturally will need financial assistance. These are countries who are backwards. They're developing a probably third world nations, and help to these countries are usually given by developed countries. So we think in line with the stance of developed countries, they have to also focus on the same thing when giving financial assistance to developing countries to balance the benefits of environment and development both to these developing countries. So we believe in three things. We believe that when giving financial assistance, there are three main things that you have to focus, i.e. sustainability of this donor country, secondly long-term planning, and lastly the relevancy of this donor country in the future. And that is why we think the environmental policies of countries, it should be a standard of granting financial assistance. And when we talk about environmental policy, we are referring to both retrospective and prospective policy, i.e. this policy could already be existing in that country, or we are also okay with attaching conditions, i.e. if you want this help, you have to take up certain conditions that will make your environment something that is more sustainable in the future. So we're okay with both retrospective and prospective policies. Society government believes in progressive development, especially for this donor country. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech today. Firstly, is it justified to attach conditions? And secondly, why is it important to attach these conditions? And lastly, why environment is a valid yardstick? But before that,
Madam, please justify to us why we should make the developing countries pay for the mistakes of the developed countries which they have made.
They're not paying for the mistakes, they're investing for the future, Mrs. Speaker. Let's look at my first point. Is it justified to attach conditions? When you look at the nature of financial assistance, Mr. Speaker, financial assistance are in full discretion at the donor country. Because of the concept of sovereignty, they can either opt in or opt out from giving this financial assistance because they have full autonomy over their money. So we think when financial assistance is given by a donor country, they open up themselves to a huge risk. What risk are we talking about? We're talking about the possibility of that money becoming a toxic investment. We're also talking about the inability of this country to pay back this money to this donor country. So we think that because of these huge risks that are attached to this money that they're giving, control and power they should have the control and power to attach reasonable conditions together to mitigate the sort of risk that they have. That is why when a lot of countries give money to Greece, they attach a lot of conditions like austerity measures to ensure that this money that is given will be something that is sustainable and can help them in the future. So we think that in this context, Mrs. Speaker, when we talk about environment has been the responsibility or the concern of developed country because it affects them directly, and more than that, Mr. Speaker, we think they have the highest responsibility under status quo because under Kyoto Protocol, these countries are Annex 1 countries who bear the most cost when it comes to environment. So we think that they have the responsibility to make sure the environment will become an important yardstick to be taken into consideration as well. So because it also affects them, Mr. Speaker, we think that it is a justified condition for developed countries to attach these conditions to this money. Secondly, why is it important to attach this condition? This is where I'm going to talk about the idea of sustainability. When you talk about donor countries, Mr. Speaker, we think that we have to make sure that they go into investments that are safe, for example, like green technology, to ensure that they have a sustainable industry. Because when you talk about the usage of resources, in a lot of other countries, a lot of development that's taken into place in these countries becomes very toxic in nature. Why? Because they're not harvested in the most stable or sustainable manner. For example, when you look at a lot of third world countries, even Bangladesh and India, when people harvest their resources, eventually in the future these resources, not just they get depleted very quickly, but more than that, it gives a lot of spillover harms to the country as a whole because environment has never been taken in as an important yardstick while harvesting these resources. So we think that it sets good precedence when now you give a platform to this country to take environment into consideration, and that's when you stop other actors in the country from making environment as something that is not important. For example, there may be government who want to make sure that environment becomes the main focus, but there are also other actors in the country doesn't want to make environment the main focus, so it eliminates the sort of friction in this country to ensure that environment will always be the focus other than development. So you also think that it ensures long-term planning, because now you give them the incentive to ensure that the development and the planning have a long-term impact. Because with our policy, because it is also prospective in nature, you allow things like consultation with this first world nation to take place. So it allows the sort of change of technology or switch in intelligence and things like that to be taken place into this country. So it ensures that the planning that's taken care is also long-term. So we think that these conditions can also be tailor-made. For example, now that you want them to develop green technology instead of normal technology, maybe more money can be given to them because it is conditioned and you can tailor-make the sort of conditions and the amount of money you give. So we also think that it is important to ensure this country to remain relevant in the future. For example, if you look at a lot of countries like Malaysia, because previously we only focused to harvest our natural resources, now we become less relevant in status quo, because we don't have the sort of status quo or long-term planning. We're not that good in green technology and things like that, because we don't focus on environment while back in the past. And lastly, why is environment a valid yardstick, Mr. Speaker? Not just we want this country to have not just that we want them to have the incentive to have long-term planning and to be relevant in the future. We also want to highlight to you that environment is an indiscriminate thing, right? The impact of environment is very indiscriminate in nature. In the fact that something that happened in Malaysia might also affect other countries, not just in Malaysia but also around the world. So we think that because of this indiscriminate impact, first world country or developed country and developing country should work hand in hand when giving money and also when implementing the sort of policies to ensure that the impact or the harms of environment can be mitigated by our proposal. And we think that when our proposal focuses on long-term planning and sustainability, it can mitigate the sort of harms that happens. We don't want these spillover effects to happen all around the world, and we think that this cooperation can mitigate the harms, and we think that it is justified for us to attach these conditions because it also benefits the donor country to make sure that we're relevant in the future. Thank you.
Two things from side opening opposition. Firstly, we believe developing nations have to prioritize their economy over environment. And secondly, I'm going to prove to you why China and India are going to love their policy, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day. But before that, let's go through a few rebuttals. Firstly, they come here and they want to talk, the stance that they take. They said that developed countries already use the environment, so now they have to stop developing nations to use the environment, Mr. Speaker. We think that's totally unfair, and that's not why that's why the people mindset is against the whole idea of the developed nations, and that's why the countries like China and India, who are independent, who do not need this sort of money and financial assistance, are going to keep violate the sort of regulation that you want to impose, Mr. Speaker, and they're going to keep bail out the countries who do not like your conditions, who will reject the conditions that you want to impose on them. But the whole idea of the whole idea of the huge risk that you want to bail them out at the end of the day. They didn't never talk what sort of aid they're talking about. Is it humanitarian or is it development? So we assume they're talking about both things. If it's a developmentary aid, no, thank you. If it's a developmentary aid, the very reason you aid them or you pay them money is to improve the industry, and indeed the people and the middle class are going to be benefited at the end of the day. So the limited money that you're sending to this country is unfair to ask them to improve the current industries that already have. Because the industries does not already require the sort of technology, the sort of green technology that they do have. That's problematic. I'm going to tell you why in my first extension. But let's look at the second idea, the whole idea of the sustainability and the industry. We think that the sustainable environment protection only comes when we are when we have a sustainable economy, Mr. Speaker. Because when you do not have money, when your people are not educated due to the lack of money that you had in your government, the people don't care about the environment, Mr. Speaker. That's why the Western nation only care about the environment when they become developed at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. So the sort of economy economic sustainability is necessary. But let's look at the third idea, the whole idea of the long term, and why suddenly the countries, by accepting these conditions, the Western countries have become so kind and start exporting stuff to this country, Mr. Speaker. I think that's a very minor issue. That's not a very important. That happens anyway, Mr. Speaker. The sort of long-term development for these countries. When we look at, especially look at countries like Saudi Arabia, or when we look at the other countries that these Western nations, they do not care at the end of the day. And the long-term, that's something different. But the last issue, the whole idea of the Malaysia, Singapore, Mr. Speaker. We think these countries, Malaysia, Singapore, they are moving towards a sort of development when it comes to green technology because they are achieving the sort of sustainable economy. But we cannot impose these laws to the countries like Somalia, to the countries, to the African countries mostly, where that's famine. They don't have enough money to feed their own children or to feed their own people, Mr. Speaker. We think that's problematic. But the first extension, the first thing I want to talk to in this thing. But the sort of economic stage that these countries are in is more important for them to prioritize the economy. When we look at the sort of financial, when we look at the economy of these countries, we have a middle class. The middle class only is empowered when we have a high rate of employment. Then we have the more industries and end of the day. No, thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, so under our paradigm, these countries have an open hand to increase the employment by empowering, and which is going to lead to the empowering the middle class, by using and abstracting more of their natural resources, Mr. Speaker, and the other day. Because now we have more number of industries. Maybe it's less regulation, but we have more people who can eat, we have more people who have income, Mr. Speaker, and we have more quantity of the people who are getting the minimum wage. But on the second level, we need to look at it. When you're imposing that sort of regulation, the cost of products is going to increase. So the purchasing power of the people is not going to be the same. Because if you're using a green technology or the green resources in your corporation or in your company, the sort of the price of the products is increasing. While your people, they do not have the money to pay for that, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day. So it's going to affect the purchasing power of the people. So at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we think when the governments have when they have industries, when they have more industries, they have an open hand, Mr. Speaker, to export the cheaper products. That's what we're seeing in China and India, which leads to the economic empowerment of the Middle East, and that's very important. But let's look at the second level on this argument. No, thank you. We need to understand the mindset of the people, the mindset of these countries, Mr. Speaker. Why? The way that they look at environment, they have not used their environment totally, Mr. Speaker. They didn't have the technology to use it because they are developing countries. So they look at environment as a source to use it, to utilize their environment, to improve themselves, Mr. Speaker. And how they are looking at the Western countries. They're looking at the Western countries as the countries who had already used their environment, Mr. Speaker. They have damaged the environment at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. And now the countries who has used the environment, who has utilized the environment, are stopping the developing nations to develop. The countries who are economically empowered to go and buy the resources of these people. Because now Western nations, they have damaged the environment, they have the money by using the environment. But these countries, Mr. Speaker, they have the environment, they are not allowed to use it, Mr. Speaker, and at the end of the day, we have resources and a Western rich country, and that's unfair, and that's what people don't. But before 6, go ahead.
Our proposal also creates job opportunity and pumping money to the economy. The only difference is that we're creating sustainable industry and they're not. How does that affect any other thing?
See, that's only true under the condition that these countries, the developing countries, agree to the condition that you're imposing. I'm going to tell you why they should not agree. On the first level in my argument, how that's an ineffective and why India and China love it. Firstly, the most countries who are violating the environmental law, Mr. Speaker, are China and India, who they don't need your money or they don't need your financial assistance at the end of the day. So the sort of major cause still remains there. But what's the harm in the second level? The second level, you know what we have seen in these countries? When Western countries stop assisting any developing nation, Mr. Speaker, the China is the first country who get in there. For example, we have Syria, for example, we have Sudan, Mr. Speaker. So when these developing countries, when they need the money to improve their industries, they reject the sort of conditions in order to have a cheaper product for their people, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, the countries like China and the countries like India are gonna bail them out anyway. So the sort of condition would not be accepted at the end of the day because there is a loophole, because there is a cheaper interest and there is a better interest for these countries. Mr. Speaker, we took the position. Firstly, we proved to you why we should prioritize the economy, and secondly, we proved to you how their proposal is not going to work anyway.